Welcome to the 261st of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. I'm coming to you live from Daejeon, South Korea. Today, I'm glad to talk with Mira Choi and Hannah Tesler about their new research on the anxiety of being Asian American in the COVID-19 pandemic. Just a reminder, you can catch COVID Calls live most weekdays at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time on YouTube. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. You can hear COVID Calls anytime, recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID Calls. Please do help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics. Please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. I've been getting a number of great suggestions lately, and I encourage you to please keep sending those. Thank you. As of today, April 19th, 2021, there are 3,021,793 deaths from COVID-19 globally. That's according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. The death toll in the United States from COVID-19 has reached 567,217. In Cambodia, it's reported that 43 have died from COVID-19, and in Thailand, they're reporting 101 deaths from COVID-19. As a way to bring some humanity to the numbers, I've been reading a life story or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic, and I'd like to continue that now with a quite extraordinary obituary, which I first saw on the Faces of COVID site. You can check out Faces of COVID on Twitter if you're not familiar with it. Alex Goldstein, who created Faces of COVID, has been a guest on COVID Calls twice. Daily, he publishes multiple obituaries of those who've died from COVID-19. This is the life story of Leah Danielle Jones, September 22nd, 1987, born and died March 12th, 2021. And I'll be reading this as it was published, which is in the first person. She wrote this herself. I, Leah Danielle Jones, was born on September 22nd, 1987, in Charlotte, North Carolina, to Eric Arnell Jones and Joyce Boast Jones. Waiting patiently at home was my elder and only brother, Jonathan Philemon Jones. I departed from my temporary home on March 12, 2021, surrounded by my family. I'm waiting for Christ's return. I was 33 and a half years young. I died due to complications from COVID-19, which none of us knew existed 1.5 years ago, 2019. I, along with others like me, are termed long haulers. The term long hauler means a person who has been infected by the virus and has recovered. No longer infectious, however, the damage had been done to vital organs. A YouTube video on this site, and I will make that link available to Leah Danielle Jones's obituary, which I am now reading. And on the site, she makes a YouTube video available. A YouTube video will inform you more explicitly the extent of this virus. Unfortunately, those like me may or may not survive the aftermath. I, hopefully, am in the minority of those numbers. I would love for as many as can watch the video and please pray and support the long haulers. What can I say but to God be the glory, great things he has done, even in my short life. He gave me qualities of compassion, generosity, boundless energy, knowledge, and determination, aka stubbornness, which my mom would say of me. If you met me, you would have never forgotten that Jones girl. I loved to cook, Dad's gift to me. I had many specialties. Bread making was just one. In my own way, I championed many causes, namely, A, people who were considered the undesirables, outcasts of society. B, support to families, especially the single home parent. C, children, those who were affected by the school closings due to the pandemic. D, victims of the hurricanes, wildfires, national and international. My mom would accuse me of disaster hunting, seeing all the good others were doing in saving lives. Mercy ships St. Jude Children's Research, Feed the Children campaigns. It didn't take much. Oh, by the way, let's not forget the poor abused animals. The gift that God entrusted with me was amazing. Nursing baby kittens, helping injured ones. It amazed even me, and I always knew it was a special gift from Him. The most rewarding part of my life was the day I was able to take care of my mom. She had been badly injured in a lawnmower accident. Being unable to properly care for herself for months, love stepped in. Of course, she protested. Stubborn woman. As my health declined and my illness progressed, I became physically hampered somewhat from doing my regular daily routine. Therefore, I leaned more heavily on the help of my mom. She, in the most part, was more than willing. The few times she was not so willing, I, Leah Danielle Jones, prevailed. I pressed on with the affairs of home and business. Yes, Dad dragged me in on this E.A. Jones plumbing adventure. Life and its pull were getting the best of me by the end of last year. However, God and my family powered the best in and for me till the end. If in this life we met, I hoped our encounter left you with a lasting snapshot of a determined, sometimes complex, genuine friend, one you could talk to. If, however, we did not meet, it was my loss, and I'm sorry. I believed that every person, experience, good or bad, added to my life a measure of maturity. Lastly, in my own defense of my very interesting family, to you, Dad Eric Arnell Jones, you were my daddy. With all your strengths and weaknesses, I would not have traded you for the world or for another earthly father. I love you. To you, Mom Joyce Ann Boast Jones, we would refer to you as Brick because of your non-compromising positions, but only when you did not agree with us. But as for your love for us, never wavered. But as for your love for us, it never wavered, like a rock. Brick, I loved you. To my dearest brother, Jonathan Philemon Jones, we had our battles, as siblings do, but when it matters, love, showed up. When you needed me, I came through, and when I needed you, Jonathan, you showed up big time. At the end, I needed you, and you said yes. Thank you, and I loved you. Don't you ever, ever forget that. To the rest of my family, uncles, aunts, cousins, and friends, I hope my life has left you with an endearing and lasting picture frame of someone who lived life her way. I loved you. May the grace of God and His marvelous love and in His power sustain you forever. With all my love, Leah. The obituary written in the first person by Leah Danielle Jones, who died last month of COVID-19. Okay, I'm going to turn to our conversation for today, and really pleased to introduce my guest to you. Mira Choi is a PhD student at Yale University. She received her bachelor's and master's degrees in sociology from Ewha Women's University in Seoul, South Korea. Her research focuses on gender, family, and urban sociology. My second guest is Hannah Tesler, also a PhD student at Yale University. She graduated from Hamilton College with a bachelor's degree in sociology, and her research focuses on race and ethnicity, gender, education, and social interactions. Mira and Hannah, thank you so much for joining me on COVID Calls today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
So let me start the way I usually do, find out where you're, and since you're there, I can see that you're there together, so you can answer however you'd like, but let us know where you're calling from and what the pandemic situation is there today.
We're calling from New Haven, Connecticut. We're neighbors. We live like 4 houses away, so we joined the call together. 1 year ago in New Haven, it was so hard to find masks, and everyone was not really aware of the COVID situation. But right now, people are pretty aware and pretty cautious, keeping social distances, wearing masks outside, working from home. And as of today, I saw in the news that 46% of residents of New Haven County are vaccinated with their first dose of COVID vaccine. Yeah, so.
Yeah. Both of us are grad students, so we've mostly just been staying at home for the past year and a couple months and working from home.
I'm really glad that you decided to do this together. It's very telling. I mean, in the same location, and throughout the pandemic, were you able to make a sort of a grad student pod there where you could actually be together and talk and share research, or did you have to spend most of the time separated throughout that early phase of the pandemic?
So we don't have a perfect pod, unfortunately, because people have roommates and
Sure.
friends and all of that. But I mean, both of us have been limiting our contact to only a few households. And so it has been nice to be able to spend time with other grad students as friends and also as research collaborators. Mira and I have been doing a lot of work during the pandemic on COVID related new research. And so we're always like working together. And it's really nice to be able to do that with somebody else rather than just staying home alone, because I know for a lot of people this is a very isolating time. So yeah, we're grateful to have that.
You've been incredibly productive through the time, and we're going to talk about your research in some detail. But before we do, maybe you could say a little bit more about some of the other. I know you both said you'd lived in other places as well. You have a bit of a global view. Maybe you could report for us what the experience of COVID has been from other places that you've been in contact with, or that you haven't been in those places, but you have maybe family or friends there.
Yeah, sure. So I've been in New Haven for the entire pandemic, and I guess for my whole grad school career so far. But before coming to grad school, I was actually living abroad in Shanghai. And I have friends who are still living and working in Shanghai, and other friends who have since repatriated back to the US during this time. So just thinking about like my personal experience when I was living abroad and in Shanghai and traveling around Asia. Now it's kind of crazy to think about because it feels so distant, but also that there are like some parts of living abroad that, and particularly living in China, where I can see how the COVID kind of controlling the pandemic has played out really differently just because of the way that surveillance and different technologies worked.
Sure.
Living in China versus living here. And, in Shanghai, there's like security cameras everywhere. And my phone number, my WeChat, my bank account, everything is all linked together to my passport. And so it's really clear that there are just different systems in place compared to the US that then when it comes to the pandemic. And I know there were really strict rules on people leaving the country and coming back into the country. And a number of my friends had like all their belongings stuck or their pets stuck in one place
Oh,
and they're
really?
in another place. Yeah, so that's been kind of dramatic experience of other foreigners living in China at the time. And yeah, but I've been in New Haven this whole time.
Yeah, I lived in Suzhou, China when I was young. And that was when they had SARS epidemic, and I was only 10 years old. But I remember taking temperatures in front of my school before I go to school. I had to wash my hands and stuff. So that was one experience of epidemic in China. But most of my childhood and adulthood before coming to New Haven, I lived in Seoul. Even though during pandemic I was in New Haven most of the time. I know that a lot of my friends in Seoul, they take this COVID very seriously, and I don't think there's much variation in terms of viewing COVID as a public health crisis. So everyone is quite serious about these kinds of dealing with pandemic. And I think wearing masks have already been some sort of common routine in South Korea due to air pollution and other like Ebola epidemic and stuff. So it was really not that hard to imagine wearing masks, but it seemed quite distant when I talk with my friends in Korea or my families in Korea and see how it's going on here in the US. I could really see the difference of how people treat the pandemic and how people kind of view this as a public health crisis or an issue of freedom So that was kind of interesting to see. Yeah.
Well, I've just moved to South Korea myself only 2 months ago. And so,
Oh,
what you're
wow.
talking about, that viewpoint from the United States and South Korea it is quite different. And to the point that you were making, Hannah, about the sort of technologies, that's similar here in South Korea. The degree to which people's banking and other kinds of activities are handled through a couple of main media providers, social media providers on their phone, which is a bit different from the United States, um, has also enabled, though, a system of rapid communication. Just to take one example, I get a text message every time there's a case reported where I am in Daejeon, which couldn't be any more different from the experience of being in the United States. So just throwing in my own perspective there, that those comparisons are really stark and interesting, I think. The bulk of your research at this time has been focusing in North America, and maybe we can turn to that. You started a study last year in which you were trying to understand and assess the social implications of the COVID-19 pandemic and people's social relationships. And that's gone in some interesting directions, particularly with a focus on anti-Asian racism, bias, and violence against Asians in America. Let me just ask you sort of a general question to tell us about the nature of the project, some of the methods that you've used. Sketch it out for us.
Sure. So we started this project pretty early on in the pandemic through a series of Zoom calls. And I mean, Mira and I were seeing each other in person. So it was clear early on. Some people made predictions of, oh, this will be over in a few weeks. But for Mira and I, and also for our advisor and the project PI, we really thought, this is going to be around for a while. And I know Grace, like at the time, even in March, she'd said, oh, I'm canceling all of my travel for the rest of 2020. And then everyone in the department said, oh, that's crazy. But as we have found out that obviously we're still in a pandemic. So we were just, having a series of different like Zoom calls, conversations, and thought about, that we really want to collect data about this, that this is something that could fundamentally transform the way that we're interacting with each other and a lot of like the social norms around interaction. So we actually collected our first wave of data last fall, and we're planning for a second wave of data collection, hopefully this fall. It's been a bit tricky because we don't know what's going to happen with the pandemic. So we had planned to collect data, I think it was like summer 2020, and then 6 months later in the winter 2020. But with the way that things went along and given the pandemic and the trajectory, we're happy with, the timing of what we have been able to do. And yeah, so we've put together an online survey, and I mean, Mira, you can talk a little bit more about the methods maybe.
Yeah, so our survey is called Longitudinal Study of Dynamics of Social Life During COVID-19. We have administered the survey through a survey company called YouGov, and we collected a nationally representative sample of 3,116 US adults, including 592 Asian adults, which is an oversample of Asians. Yeah, we collected a bunch of data, basic data about people's sociodemographic status, but also we asked questions about people's attitudes towards social relationships like dating or friendships, whether they, like during COVID, whether they want to have more children or pets, like their attitudes towards these kinds of new level of commitment in their relationships. But we also asked questions about anti-Asian or anti-racism incidents and involvement in social justice movements during COVID-19 to see how people are actually reacting to COVID and how COVID is impacting people's social relationships, well-being, and their attitudes towards other race and ethnicity.
I have a lot of questions. I just to sort of at a first level, just to maybe you could break down for us some of the kind of theoretical background to this. The idea is to explore social relationships under stress, and so the pandemic provides a format to examine those, or is that the framework that you're working with? Tell us a little bit more about the kind of theoretical implications of these kinds of questions.
Yeah, so we're thinking both social relationships under stress, but also, I mean, cross our fingers, hopefully at some point, COVID pandemic as it is will be over, maybe not entirely, but that people will go back to quote unquote normal life. And so we're really looking at whether or not there are sustained changes that come after the pandemic.
Okay.
And that's why we wanted to do like longitudinal data collection to kind of see, are these changes temporary? And every single day in the news headlines, we see, COVID is making people lonely. COVID is, causing this and that. And we wanted to kind of look at some of the more enduring potential consequences of COVID. And obviously, there's a lot of really great and quick research coming out about the COVID-19 virus itself and the spread and the health implications of COVID. But we were seeing less about the kind of social dimension of what's happening during COVID. So that's one area that our research was hoping to address, is kind of looking at, this pandemic obviously is has a lot of cases and is impacting a lot of people in terms of getting sick and passing away. But at the same time, especially social distancing guidelines and stay-at-home orders are impacting almost everyone worldwide. So we wanted to look at how is COVID actually making an impact on everyone, and going beyond just the people who are getting sick, which obviously also is important to study and terrible.
It's really interesting. I mean, just to sort of slow that down, because I really, this kind of disaster research more broadly, there's some really complicated things going on in what you're trying to assess here. One is to get people's sense of how their day-to-day life and their social relationships that you're focusing on are changing, which you're building the study literally as those changes are unfolding day by day. So it's not like things changed and I can give you a list, but it's dynamic. And then the other part, which I think is really super important that you pointed to, is what kinds of changes then become a sort of I mean, the phrase new normal is overused. I'm not quite sure what else to say, but become a new life pathway, a new set of relationships, changes that become more permanent or more long lasting. Both of those are really difficult things to undertake. So congratulations on doing that and getting the survey out. I wonder what those early team meetings must have been like when you were brainstorming the kinds of areas that you were expecting to see changes. Mira, can you speak to some of that?
Yeah, so basically all of us were really interested in how social distancing guidelines and the new normative expectations around keeping the distance and having a small social gathering or limiting your social gathering, how that would change people's perceptions of dating or friendships or loneliness. And many of the media attention focuses on how people are really lonely and how people are lonely because of the social distancing. But we also found that we also kind of expected that, especially in the context of South Korea, when we were having this Zoom meetings with some of our colleagues in South Korea, that some people are kind of actually relieved to be away from these kinds of all the social gatherings and kind of mandatory events that you have to attend to. So people are actually happy to be at home, spending more time with their family. So there were these kinds of mixed ideas around how social distancing is changing people's perceptions of social relationships. So that was a big part of our survey, kind of looking at whether the COVID is actually only bringing negative consequences, or are there some positive consequences of COVID, that people are so tied together with a lot of social commitments these days. Yeah, so that was like one big part of our survey.
Yeah, I think one thing to mention also is that we actually worked also, part of our team is in South Korea. And so we first did a data collection effort last summer, adding questions to a nationally representative survey in South Korea. So we were able to kind of do preliminary surveying through that. And we're currently working on a couple papers with that data. There's one that was published, but we were hoping that we could kind of create a comparison between the US and South Korea, since they are two kind of extreme cases of how they've managed the pandemic, and kind of the level of impact that the pandemic has had on everyday life. And yeah, so we're still working on that, but I think that kind of was part of what we were thinking of in this very comparative way, looking at how different social contexts could result in different changes to everyday life. And obviously in the US, like politics and all of that, and gender and all these things are very relevant.
I'm glad you pointed that out. So, I mean, just to clarify, you managed to get questions of your own design into a study that was deployed in South Korea at a national level?
Yes.
That's really great and very promising. And I wonder, so that's work that's ongoing, but it'll be interesting to follow that. So much of the pandemic, I think, reporting, because so much of public health response is national in scale. We have this kind of picture of like people around the world, behind their flag, and that's what the pandemic has meant. It's been I've been a little distressed actually about the degree to which we focus on nationalism and national identity as the defining feature of how people are experiencing the pandemic. It seems like you want to go a little bit beyond that to try to find some commonalities, even if perhaps across those boundaries. I'm curious how you actually design something like that to carry off that comparison. Can you say just a little bit more about that?
Sure. Well, we wanted to ask questions in kind of similar ways in order to come up with comparative data. But I mean, one tricky thing is that there's like the GSS, like the General Social Survey, and then KGSS, the Korean General Social Survey, and both of these like national surveys then ask questions about like well-being and happiness and all of that. So we wanted to match those questions so we can sample, like compare it to the baseline of this national context during non-pandemic times. But then we also wanted our questions to relate to each other as best as possible so that we can kind of see any differences between the US and Korea. And I mean, even in terms of something like well-being, there's questions that we asked about feeling lonely, feeling happy, feeling stressed, feeling anxious. And the kind of range of how people are responding to that is quite different across different contexts. Like Americans tend to be more optimistic and be saying more positive things. Whether or not that's true, that they actually are feeling that way, is a different question methodologically. But that's one thing that we were kind of taking into consideration was designing the questions in a way that we could look at both of the sets of data almost side by side and compare.
Just a reminder, you're listening to COVID Calls, and I'm talking to Mira Choi and Hannah Tesler today about the social impact of COVID-19 in the United States, and we're hearing about some of their comparative research as well. So you said that you oversampled Asian Americans on the North American part of this work. So let's talk about that aspect of it. And one of the early publications that has come out in this is titled "The Anxiety of Being Asian American: Hate Crimes and Negative Biases During the COVID-19 Pandemic." So you found some crucial things pretty early on. Mira, let me bring you in on this first. What was the idea in oversampling Asian Americans? What were you trying to understand in their experience? And I guess maybe sort of add on to that, what were some of the preliminary assumptions that you had about why you would think the Asian American experience of the pandemic might be different from others?
Yeah, so early on last year, when Hannah, I and our co-author Grace Cow, we wrote our paper, "The Anxiety of Being Asian American." We are already pretty aware of how people are reacting to COVID in relation to xenophobia and like especially Trump administration kind of keep referring to this COVID as China virus. We've already found back like a year ago that there are some racial incidents, biases, and against Asian Americans in the United States. So we were pretty aware of this situation, and we knew that this is a very serious. This would have serious consequences on Asian Americans' daily lives during COVID and their well-being. Especially, we have a lot of friends and families around in the U.S. and know how they've been feeling anxious and worried going outside during COVID. So, keeping that in mind, we really thought that it's important to have oversampling of Asian Americans to kind of, because there are not that many data sets that are nationally representative that has enough of Asian Americans in the respondent sample. So we really wanted to have that large number of Asian Americans, and we expected that Asian Americans would, compared to before, they would report more negative racial incidents against Asian Americans during COVID. Yeah, so that was one of the biggest assumption that we had, and that's what we find as well. So we find a high rates of Asian Americans reporting racial incidents. So in our data set, 25% of our Asian American respondents reported that they experienced racial incidents, or their close friend or family members experienced racial incidents. Yeah.
That's a staggering figure. Just first of all, just to underline that, and it's been in the news more this year under this administration, and President Biden has been articulate about this. But your study came out last year. I mean, this is something you were tracking really from the beginning. Say a little bit more, if you could, Hannah, coming to you, about the nature of the kinds of incidents that people reported.
Sure. So we actually published that article last summer, summer 2020. And then I think one thing that's been particularly heartbreaking to me is that now there's a lot of national attention on this issue, particularly after the Atlanta mass shooting. But at the same time, this has been something that's been going on for so long. I mean, both during the COVID pandemic, like in March and April, there were news reports about people getting shouted racial slurs at, people getting punched. And there was like one incident of a attempted murder where a Burmese American family was stabbed outside of like Sam's Club, Walmart, that kind of supermarket. But actually, a lot of people have not been paying attention to this issue until a mass murder. And so to me, I think it's quite sad that, there has been so much loss of life that had to predicate this becoming, a hashtag on Twitter and something that people are paying attention to, because these racial incidents have been going on for a long time. And that's something that we talk about in our article, and something that other organizations, such as like Stop AAPI Hate, from the onset of the pandemic, that they've been collecting self-reports of anti-Asian incidents. And actually, we see that there have been like a lot. I think it's like over 3,000 racial incidents against Asian Americans. And they range from like verbal assaults to physical assaults. And yeah, all of that has been more in the news now, but is definitely not a new phenomenon.
So this article, the anxiety of being Asian, and I just want to make sure I have the title correct here so people can find it and read it on their own. The Anxiety of Being Asian American, Hate Crimes and Negative Biases During the COVID-19 Pandemic appeared in the American Journal of Criminal Justice in June. And so you already had, by that time, reports, as you're pointing out, of aggressions and microaggressions as well. And I just want to read one little bit from here. It's a really complicated article in your findings. I think we have to spend some time with these. I'm just quoting for you here. You said, hate crimes have increased the anxiety of Asian Americans during already uncertain times, with many fearful for their physical safety when running everyday errands. Asian Americans are now self-conscious about, quote unquote, coughing while Asian and concerned about being targeted for hate crimes. You go on, there's evidence to suggest that Asian Americans underreport crimes, and some recent immigrants may lack an understanding of the legal system and process of reporting crimes. So there's a lot happening there. Let's take a little bit of that, sort of segregate that a little bit. About the underreporting issue, where does that come from? Help us understand why Asian Americans may underreport these kinds of bias incidents, either verbal assault or physical assault.
Okay.
Sorry, I should direct it to one of you since
Oh,
you're
no, it's
both
okay.
together there. Hannah, go ahead.
It's just hard to know. I mean, I think there's a lot of different reasons why these types of bias incidents and hate crimes would be underreported. Some of it, I think, is language barrier, or like that a lot of Asian Americans are new immigrants to the US and may not necessarily totally like see what is happening against them as racism and as xenophobia. And I think that could come from a place of optimism of not wanting to see racism and xenophobia in a place where they are just arriving to. But I think on top of that, there's a lot, and one thing that we talk about in our article more at length is around the way that Asian Americans have been seen throughout history as, always foreign and always as an outsider, even if they have been in the US for a long time. And so at the same time, Asian Americans, particularly compared to other racial minority groups, some Asian Americans have achieved more quote unquote success in terms of levels of education and income and these other kind of measures. And a lot of that foreignness but success has been around what in sociology we call like the model minority stereotype. And a lot of the kind of social and cultural norms around trading in your complicity and silence and kind of absorbing different like racial incidents and negative slurs or these kinds of things as something that is par for the course and something that is not that big of a deal, quote unquote. And I think that especially there has been a lot of almost gaslighting around Asian Americans' experiences of violence and of racial violence, to the extent where before COVID, it wasn't necessarily dangerous for me, for example, to go out to the grocery store. I wouldn't be worried about being shot by the cops or being otherwise physically assaulted. I mean, besides like being a woman and being vulnerable in that way,
Right.
I think in terms of being Asian American, there weren't these kind of physical threats of violence before COVID. But that's not to say that these kind of sentiments of seeing Asian Americans as foreigners and outsiders didn't exist. And so I think the way that that's manifested is very legible to people as violence, but has not always been. And because of that, I think a lot of people would choose to, look the other way or minimize the violence and say, oh, well, it's really not that big of a deal, particularly if saying that it's not a big deal will help give you more access to privilege, power, elite spaces that other racial minorities, if they are quote unquote like acting too angry or making a fuss, wouldn't be able to have. So I think it's complicated, the history.
It is complicated. And Mira, I want to bring you in on this as well, but just to underline a couple of things that Hannah said there, which I think are really profound. One is that recently arrived immigrants may not want to believe or may not want to see. I hadn't really thought of this before, but if their arrival indicates a certain optimism about a new life. I don't want to oversell that because those lives are hard, but at the same time, some unwillingness to believe that those kinds of things could happen to them. And then you have this model minority stereotype, which is also working, which seems like it might push the other way, that these kinds of attacks, when reported, might not be believed. And so that makes a really difficult combination of factors to try to understand also that this is not coming from nowhere, that this is a set of social conditions that pre-exist the pandemic, but then somehow the pandemic crystallizes them into a social effect that you can really begin to measure. Mira, to comment on anything I just said or correct me on any of the assumptions I'm working with there, or anything else you want to add to it?
I'm a recent immigrant in the US. So as a personal, with my personal experience, I really think that the pandemic has shed light on the racial, how the racial biases against Asians can be my own experience. Before that, even though before that, coming to the US for the first time, I was expecting a lot of difference from what I've been experiencing in South Korea, and have optimism in terms of my career and everything. But then pandemic happened in 6 months, and it kind of really made me realize the status of Asians in the US and how Asian Americans are always seen as perpetual foreigners. So yeah, with my personal experience, I can also I agree with all you're working on. Yeah.
Oh, just let me ask one follow-up question. This idea of the perpetual foreigner, and so it goes back to a deep history in the United States of, and we don't have to go through all of them, but I mean, Japanese internment during World War II, or specific legislative acts that restricted Chinese immigration into the United States and into the 19th century. We don't have to look far to find really structural, legal moments in law in the United States in which these structures of bias are there. But I guess I'm curious to hear a little bit more. Hannah, let me ask you this first. How that does persist. I mean, what are some of the social factors that you look at for the persistence of this idea of a sort of perpetual outsider, Asian Americans somehow always being othered in American society?
So your question is, why do you think it persists? Or
why does it? Yeah, exactly.
It's a difficult question to answer. I mean, I think the way that Asian Americans, for example, have been positioned vis-a-vis race is very different from the immigration history of other Americans. And for example, Irish Americans or Italian Americans or Jewish Americans historically have been racialized and seen as foreign, but that has not always persisted. And now they kind of have been subsumed into the category of white. And there is a question, an open-ended question of, are Asians the new whites, or are Asians superior to whites, or that kind of thing. But at the same time, Asianness has always been treated as separate. And so even when Asian Americans, and I know that in 1960, maybe 64, 65, there was a New York Times article that first coined the idea of the model minority through looking at Japanese Americans as a success story, quote unquote, and how that Asian Americans are the minority that made it, and that are able to achieve the American dream, so to speak, in terms of education and homeownership and all these things. And I think that that positioning of Asian Americans as foreign is not accidental. That Asian Americans continue to be treated as foreign and continue to be treated as not fully American, or can't just be American, because it serves as a tool to then distinguish and separate Asian Americans from other racial minorities, such as Black Americans, Latinx communities, and put them as a kind of wedge and a counterexample of, oh, look, these are racial minorities and they could be successful or they could be assimilated into America. And if only you work harder and follow the rules and act like Asian Americans do, then you can also have this. But that still comes at the price of Asian Americans being foreign and not fully American, that you would never
Right.
be American without that label.
Yeah. Thank you for taking that on, for, I think, giving a really some nice insights there, because it is complicated and long-standing sort of problem. Another thing I've seen in the press is some critique or concern about this terminology, and I wonder how you struggle with that as well. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, for example. I mean, that encompasses a vast range of people from a huge part of the world. So, I mean, even that question of, how do we determine Asian American identity? And I guess to make it even more difficult, you're asking people that you're surveying to engage with that or not engage with that. That strikes me as a difficult methodological problem as well. I mean, I guess sort of any thoughts about that? What are the difficulties of trying to understand the experience of Asian Americans, broadly speaking? Or is that just a category that has held up very well for you in the research? Mira, can you speak to that?
Yeah, so we had a very hard time kind of finalizing how we are going to ask a question about their identification of race and ethnicity, because that itself is a really complicated issue. People don't have a straightforward like one single identity of their race or ethnicity. So it was really, we had to go through a lot of other surveys that previously asked questions about race and ethnicity to find how people ask these questions. So we kind of try to incorporate as much variety as possible and kind of ask questions in a way where people can choose multiple race or multiple ethnicity, so that we can kind of cross-check and see people could identify themselves as Asian, but people can identify themselves as American, but could be Asian in their ethnicity. So that's how we kind of went about to deal with this complicated issue of identification with race.
It seems to me that one of the real implications of this work is not only for people living in the United States, but also other parts of the world. And I'll just share with you that after the Atlanta shootings here at KAIST in Daejeon, we brought together a group of graduate students and faculty because Koreans are part of a diaspora, and many South Koreans will also spend some time in Europe or in the United States studying or visiting family. They have extended family networks, business networks, whatever it may be. And it was, to me, it was a really illuminating conversation to hear my colleagues and friends, students here talking about their own concerns about what's happening in America. And I know you've been doing sort of comparative work. I don't know if your work yields any insights on that, but I think a lot of times Americans think whatever happens in America only involves Americans, and so it's an internal problem. I think on this issue, it's a global problem, certainly. And the students and my friends here really knew a lot about what was happening, about the kinds of findings that you're pointing to in America. I wonder, in your discussions with Korean colleagues here where I am, what those discussions have been like in terms of the implications of anti-Asian bias in America for Asians in other parts of the world. I don't know if maybe Mira, I can ask you that first.
Yeah, so in our survey study, we didn't ask about this in anti-Asian hate crime in the Korean survey, but I've been talking a lot with the Korean team and some of my friends in Korea, and anti-Asian hate, it's not something that's only happening in the United States. A lot of my friends and colleagues have traveled to Europe and other Western countries, quote unquote, and they have experienced, especially Asian women, have experienced racial slurs, like when when we're walking by, someone would like meow at you as if you're a cat, or like they would like sexually assault Asian women so easily. So this kind of anti-Asian hate crime and slurs, it's not really a novel thing that's just happening during the pandemic. It has been our daily experience when we're out traveling abroad or going to some other Western context. So people were really sympathetic about it and worried about their friends and families living in the US, and kind of this brought like a broader sense of solidarity among Asian communities where people really take into consideration how Asian race and ethnicity is contextualized in the global context.
Let me ask you a question, additional question about the impact of research like this. And this is a question I ask myself all the time. So I really want to know, sort of your own, so you can illuminate me about this. What kind of results should you expect, or could you expect, from these kinds of findings? I mean, what you're pointing to and really documenting in a thorough way are just really distressing features in American life that have pre-exist the pandemic and then have been made worse in the pandemic. Who needs to read this research, Hannah? What kinds of impacts or changes could you expect to flow from this kind of social science?
I think one thing is just that these findings could be disseminated more broadly and could be integrated into, public school curriculum. And particularly if I think back to my experience, I mean, I grew up in the US and went to public school through my entire through high school career. And we never really learned about Asian American history or even Asian history in Asia. We were required to take US history, but learning about Asian history or Asian American history, or even having Asian Americans be part of US history courses, was not something that was taught. And so all of the things that I've learned about, from, Japanese internment to Vincent Chin and to the history of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and all of this is material that I've learned since high school and since growing up. And I think that in the US, we do a really bad job of actually teaching people about the history of Asians in America. And so that's one area that I think could be really useful in terms of disseminating this research and helping people understand and learn more about the context. Because even if you compare it to like the history of other immigrant groups, I feel like I learned more about, the Irish famine and the potato farmers and their plight of coming to the US in the 1800s and all of that. Like, I feel like that's sticks more in my brain as something that I learned about in school than Asian Americans, and like how Asian Americans were building the railroads and were migrant labor and were coolie labor. Like, I didn't know about the term coolie until college or whatever. And so I think those are all things that people shouldn't have to learn about on their own. Like, you shouldn't have to seek out that information because you're interested in this issue. I think education is one really obvious and also really effective way that people could learn more about this.
So pointing to those profound gaps in education so that people don't have to be surprised, and pushing back on this model minority stereotype that you were talking about earlier. I wonder also about this underreporting issue. So that's what maybe everyone can do, and what educators can do and school districts can do. But to bring it back to people who are suffering this violence themselves, how can research like this go some distance, do you think, to intervene a little bit in that space? Because clearly we need more support and a different kind of environment for Asian Americans to feel like they can report bias incidents. Mira, I wonder how this kind of work, do you think, can influence that possibility?
Yeah, so I think people getting to know more about this anti-Asian hate crime tend to realize that the things that are happening around them is anti-Asian hate crime. So in our data, we find that people who are more reading more news and spend more time on social media are more aware of the anti um, Asian hate crime, and they tend to participate more in social justice movements related to racism. So that clearly shows that being more exposed to these kinds of incidents and being aware of what consists of anti-Asian hate crime really helps people to realize that the things that are happening are anti-Asian hate crime, and that could also lead to broader implications of participating in the social justice movement, learning more about it, or donating money, or volunteering to help social organizations that kind of are organized to um, eliminate racism in the US. So, yeah.
Well, thank you both. I mean, those are really concrete answers, and I think, I mean, to me, the social science is worthy to do in and of itself because it's important to document and explain these phenomena as they're happening. But I think we all want to see the kind of work that you're doing really get uptake in the policy process. But policy is not just what happens in Congress, as you point out. It also can be what happens at social justice level, at the activist level, in the classroom. And those are really important ways to see how your work will have impact. We're almost up on time today with Hannah Tesler and Mira Choi on COVID calls. Really lively discussion, and I want to talk about, if you can spare me another couple of minutes, about another paper that you published about arts and crafts as an educational strategy and coping mechanism. So this is another trans-Pacific comparative study that you've done in the midst of the pandemic. Talk to us a little bit about this. It's I suppose it's not unrelated to the previous work, but quite different in its orientation. Maybe Mira, can I start with you about this?
Yeah, so we were really interested in learning more about how parents with children are coping with the current COVID pandemic, since they're mostly guided to work from home, and they have double the burden of working and taking care of their children during during the COVID pandemic. So we looked into some of the consumer reports and looked into data sets in online parents communities, and kind of found out that parents are paying attention to arts and crafts as their coping mechanism during COVID-19, showing virtual concerts or virtual museum tour is something that came up during COVID-19. But we also found that these kinds of arts and crafts or virtual art experiences can be limited to upper class parents who have the cultural capital to point to these kinds of creative activities during COVID, where children have a lot of time spending at home with less resources, educational resources. So that was, yeah, one.
That's fascinating. Hannah, did this come from the first study? I mean, is this something that the questions you were asking, you got some indicator that this was also, unique set of challenges that parents were facing, and so you built the second study, or is this somehow separate?
I mean, it's hard to remember now, but I guess
I'll ask you to reconstruct.
We've looked at a lot of different impacts of COVID on both parents and education and like social relationships and all of these kind of different areas where COVID has caused this disruption in how people's everyday lives are kind of being enacted. And so, yeah, I think we kind of conceived of and a part of this was just paying a lot of attention to the news and to what's going on and to um, tying back to our own research interests in like gender and parenting and education, that these are things that both of us in our own research agenda and outside of COVID have looked into in the past and have done work on. So I think in some ways it's separate from the anti-Asian hate research, but it's all under the kind of umbrella of these different ways that COVID has impacted people's lives, and looking beyond just COVID as a disease and as a pandemic, but also at these other dimensions of how COVID could be perpetuating existing inequalities or
Right.
exacerbating inequalities and kind of revealing a lot of the discrimination or just general inequities in the way that our social system works
One of the
worldwide.
things that certainly revealed in the United States was the often uncounted and invisible labor of childcare. And all of a sudden, it made a lot of that very visible because children were at home and fathers were at home, and the news media was paying attention to this sort of new space that had been created, which is the nuclear family together at home all the time. And the house becomes the classroom as well. I wonder, let me just ask a little bit of a follow-up about the South Korean case. What has been the experience, and it seems like this paper must have touched on that a little bit, of parents in South Korea and the schools there? I'm here. So anyway, but can you say a little bit about that and how that compares to the experience in the United States?
Yeah, definitely one big difference between the US and Korea is that in Korea, the burden of childcare is predominantly on women. And I think in Korea, compared to the US, there has been less kind of changes towards working from home and remote commuting. So I think a lot of the Korean employees were still going to the companies to go to work. So most of the fathers who are the breadwinners in South Korea have been still going in person to work, and mothers were mostly spending time at home taking care of their children. So what we find in our paper is that mothers have been posting a lot of ideas about arts and crafts and how they can spend time with their children, provide educational motivations and kind of resources to their children. So that kind of gender difference is much stark in South Korea compared to the US.
I see. Well, thank you for that. We're almost up on time now. I just want to give both of my guests a chance if they wanted to say a little bit about future work or work that's ongoing. Maybe you can give us just a little bit of some headlines, things we can look for coming out of your research group. I know you're working there, Mira Choi, Hannah Tesler, and also with Grace Kao there at Yale. Mira, to you, anything you want to tell us about some of this work that you're really excited about coming up?
Yeah, so we're working on several manuscripts based on our data set, and one of the work is on how during COVID, worrying about your family members or even broader community has become a sort of care work during COVID, and how that is disproportionately affecting women's well-being during COVID. And we have another paper on social relationships and how people how people's attitudes toward datings changed during COVID. So we have several manuscripts coming up, but also we are expecting to collect second wave of data this fall, kind of to see how the long-term effect of COVID, whether there is a long-term effect of COVID on multiple aspects of social lives.
Hannah, let me give you the last word. It sounds like we're going to have you back later in the year to get an update about what that second harvesting of data looks like. Hannah, last word to you on this.
Yeah, I mean, Mira summarized it up pretty well, that we have a couple other papers in progress, and also that, we're still very much in the midst of our data collection and data analysis, one thing from our survey that we have not fully analyzed yet is that we did ask open response questions about positive and negative changes to your life over the past few months, from when we asked our survey, which is all during COVID. And so not everybody filled in a response. And we're still in the process of coding those responses into different subcategories. And we're hoping to create kind of a data set around that and then linking that to the other sociodemographic factors, because a lot of people brought up topics that we wouldn't necessarily have known about from just our survey questions alone. And so that's one other future avenue where, again, we're still in the middle of doing that data collection and data analysis. And it's really interesting because there are so many things that get seen differently by people in the US. So, for example, mask wearing, for some people, it's a positive consequence, and people feel safer and people feel, it's healthier and it's more responsible to the people around you. Whereas other people are complaining about mask wearing and saying that it restricts their freedom and think that, America is like turning into a fascist state, and all that. So the open responses, we're really looking forward to kind of delving more into that data analysis. But of course, because it's an open response question, that it is more complicated to kind of parse through those results. So that's another longer term project that we're working on too.
You've been listening to COVID Calls, and you can catch COVID Calls every weekday at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And this week, we'll also have a Friday episode with guests here where I am in South Korea at a special time. So please look for that announcement. And I want to thank my guests, Hannah Tesler and Mira Choi, for spending this time today talking about their really fascinating research, and best of luck to you as you go forward with it. Thanks for sharing this time today.
Thank you so much.
Stay healthy, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow, 5:30.